Have you ever, looked in the mirror and wondered, where'd I get these eyes?
Or maybe see one of those ads for DNA tests. The ones like discover your ancestry with just a cheek swab.
Right. It's like, who are we really? It's a pretty big question. And now, you can just pop down to the drugstore and maybe get a little closer to an answer. It's kind of wild. So today we're diving deep into Text 7, which is all about this whole trend of DNA testing kits, those PTKs,
Yeah,
and the bigger picture of commercial genetic testing, all of that.
exactly. And Text 7 gives us this really interesting look at the industry. Like, not just how easy it is to get these tests, but also some of the debates that are going on. Especially with ancestry testing, there are some pretty big questions. So today we really want to break it all down, like give you a clear picture of what these tests can do, but also what some experts are saying about, maybe what they can't do.
Yeah, so think of this as like a crash course. You'll be totally up to speed on this whole DNA testing thing, but without all the super technical jargon. Okay, so let's jump into it. One thing that really struck me in the text was the whole paternity testing kit thing. I mean, you can walk into a drugstore, spend $30, pick up a kit, and then for what was it, another 120, boom, you have your results.
It's pretty incredible.
It's crazy. Like Identigene, the company they mentioned, they've sold over 60,000 of these things since they became available over the counter. That was just last year. Think about that. A question that used to need lawyers and courtrooms can now be answered with a trip to CVS.
Right. It really shows you just how accessible this technology has become. And the text even points out that, there are tons of DNA tests out there, not just paternity ones. Like over 24 companies selling these tests directly to people, and the prices can be all over the place. Some are a couple $100, some are like over $2,500.
Wow, that is a big range. I mean, thinking about how easy it is to get these tests and all the different types, it has to make people wonder, what else are these things used for besides just, figuring out paternity? I mean, I'm curious.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what's cool about Text 7. It actually gets into that. Paragraph 3, I think it was, talks about some other popular uses. So beyond paternity, you have something called kinship testing, which is
Oh.
basically like using DNA to figure out how people are biologically related.
Hmm.
So the text mentions how this is used a lot by adopted people who were looking for their biological families, or families who, are trying to find children who were placed for adoption.
Yeah, that makes total sense. It's like everyone wants to know where they come from, right? It's this really deep human thing.
For sure.
The text also mentioned that genealogists use these tests a lot, people who are really into family history. And there are even companies popping up that will help you figure out where your family came from geographically, like using your DNA. I mean, imagine just a little bit of saliva and you could, trace your ancestors back to a specific place. That's got to be pretty cool.
It is. It really taps into this fascination we have with our origins.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to step back and understand how these tests actually work. And the text explains that pretty well in paragraph 4. Basically, they take a sample of your cells, usually by swabbing your saliva, and then they compare it to, well, a comparison sample, like the text says. So you don't just spit in a tube and get your whole family history magically revealed.
Right. So it's not like, here's your DNA, tell me everything. There has to be something to compare it to.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so we've got paternity tests, kinship tests for adopted folks, ancestry stuff. It all seems pretty straightforward, but then the text starts talking about some skepticism, and it gets pretty interesting.
It does. The sociologist, Troy Duster from NYU, he raises a really important point about what he calls false precision in ancestry testing. He says that, yeah, these tests might tell you you're 20% from this region, 15% from that region, but it's way more complicated than that.
Okay, so break down this false precision idea for me. What's he getting at?
So Duster's point is, if you think about it, all of us, we have a ton of ancestors. You go back a few centuries, and we're talking hundreds of people. But most ancestry tests, they only focus on one line. So either the Y chromosome, which comes from your father's side, or mitochondrial DNA, which is passed down through your mother's side.
I see.
So it's kind of like looking at one branch of this massive family tree and thinking you've seen the whole thing.
Oh, okay. I get it.
Right. The text even puts some numbers on it. It says these tests might give you info about 1 or 2 ancestors, maybe, but then you go back just 3 generations and you have 6 other great-grandparents, and then 4 generations back, 14 other great-great-grandparents. So it's a very, very narrow view, really.
Like a tiny snapshot then.
Exactly. So, you get that result that says you're 20% Irish, and it might feel really definitive, but you have to remember it's just one piece of a much bigger, more complicated story.
Yeah, like way more complex than any percentage could show.
Absolutely.
It really makes you think twice about those ancestry reports.
It does. And the text doesn't stop there either. There's also skepticism about the accuracy of like all commercial genetic testing, really. And this has to do with what they call reference collections.
Reference collections? What are those?
They're basically like the databases that the companies use. So they compare your DNA sample to all the data they have in these collections.
Ah, okay.
But here's the thing. The text points out that these databases, they don't always use like systematically collected data. Sometimes they're just lumping together information from a bunch of different research projects. So it's not like there's this perfect organized family tree for the whole world.
Right.
It's more like piecing together different bits and pieces.
Yeah. So basically what you're saying is, depending on the company, you might get totally different results.
It's possible, yeah. It's like getting different opinions from different historians who each have access to different archives. It's not always a clear-cut answer.
It makes you wonder how reliable it all really is.
It does. And then there's this other point the text brings up. It's about the computer programs that these companies use to figure out, like, how people are related to estimate those relationships.
Okay, and what's the issue there?
Well, the problem is that a lot of these programs are patented. So they're basically secret. They belong to the company.
Ah, I see.
And what that means is they're not always subject to peer review, like other scientists checking their work. And that lack of transparency, it makes some people nervous. It's kind of like a black box.
Yeah.
We don't really know how they're getting to those conclusions.
It's interesting. Okay, so we've covered like the basics of these tests, what they're used for, and some of the big criticisms. Now, the text also has some multiple choice questions. Want to try to tackle those?
Sure.
All right, let's start with question 1. It says, in paragraphs 1 and 2, the text shows PTK's easy availability, flexibility in pricing, successful promotion, popularity with households. So from those first 2 paragraphs, what really jumps out at you?
Well, the main thing those paragraphs talk about is how easy it is to get those paternity testing kits. Like they say, shell out $30 at the drugstore, and they're without prescriptions now. Plus, you've got that statistic about over 60,000 purchases.
Right, like people are buying them.
Yeah. So easy availability seems like the best fit.
What about the other choices? Like flexibility in pricing.
Well, the text does mention different prices for DNA tests later on, but in those first paragraphs, they're talking about a specific price for the PTKs, the drugstore ones. It's not really highlighting a ton of different price options for those.
Okay, so it's a very specific price and very accessible.
Right.
Okay, what about successful promotion?
Well, they give us sales figures, so we know they're selling, but they don't actually describe any promotions. So we're kind of assuming they're popular because they're selling, but we don't know anything about how they were marketed or how successful that was.
Right, so we don't have the full picture.
Right. And then popularity with households. Again, the sales numbers kind of imply that, but the text is really emphasizing how easy it is to buy them. So easy availability seems like a more direct answer.
Like it's the core message.
Exactly.
Okay, let's look at question 2. PTK is used to locate one's birthplace, promote genetic research, identify parent-child kinship, choose children for adoption. Where in the text should we be looking to answer this?
I think we should go back to paragraph 3, where it talks about the most popular uses for these tests.
Okay.
And there, it specifically mentions paternity and kinship testing, and it says adopted children use kinship testing to find their biological relatives.
Right.
So identify parent-child kinship seems like the most obvious answer.
It's right there, plain and simple.
Right.
What about the other options, like locate one's birthplace?
That sounds more like the ancestry testing they talk about later.
Yeah, it's not really about a specific place, right? It's about relationships.
Exactly.
What about promote genetic research?
Well, I guess, like, in a way, anytime someone takes one of these tests, it adds to the data that researchers can use. But that's not the main reason someone would buy a PTK.
Yeah, they're not buying it for science. They're buying it for a very specific reason.
Right.
And then the last one, choose children for adoption. That seems like a stretch.
Yeah, they talk about families using kinship testing to track down kids who were put up for adoption. But that's about finding existing relatives after an adoption, not choosing children for an adoption.
Yeah, totally different. Okay, on to question 3. Skeptical observers believe that ancestry testing fails to trace distant ancestors, rebuild reliable bloodlines, fully use genetic information, achieve the claimed accuracy. Now, which part of the text talks about the skeptics?
That would be paragraph 5, where they introduce Troy Duster and his skepticism.
And what's his main argument again?
So his big thing is false precision. He's saying that because these tests only look at the Y chromosome or mitochondrial DNA, they're really only giving a very limited view of a person's ancestry,
Yeah.
even though they claim to give these really specific breakdowns.
So they're claiming to be super accurate, but they're not really.
Exactly.
So achieve the claimed accuracy. That seems like a good fit.
Right. It's not that you can't trace any distant ancestors, but the accuracy of those claims, that's what's in question.
Makes sense. What about the others? Trace distant ancestors?
Well, he's not saying it's impossible, just that the results might not be as accurate or complete as they claim.
Okay, so achieve the claimed accuracy is more precise.
Right.
Rebuild reliable bloodlines.
That sounds more like something a genealogist would be interested in, not necessarily the main criticism of the tests themselves.
Okay, and fully use genetic information.
Well, it's true that they only look at a small part of your DNA, but Duster's point is more about the accuracy of what they're saying based on that limited information.
Right, right. Okay, question 4. In the last paragraph, a problem commercial genetic testing faces is disorganized data collection, overlapping database building, excessive sample comparison, lack of patent evaluation. Where should we be looking for this one?
Last paragraph, paragraph 6.
Okay.
And right there it says, databases used by some companies don't rely on data collected systematically, but rather lump together information from different research projects.
So disorganized data collection?
Yeah, I think so.
Seems pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
What about overlapping database building? Is that a problem?
I don't think they mentioned that as a problem specifically. The issue is more about how the databases are built.
Okay, so it's not the overlapping, it's the method.
Right.
What about excessive sample comparison?
The text doesn't say there are too many comparisons happening. The problem is with the data itself, the stuff they're comparing to.
Okay. And then the last one, lack of patent evaluation.
They do mention that the computer programs might not be peer-reviewed because they're patented, but the disorganized data collection, that seems like a bigger, more basic problem.
Yeah, it kind of undermines the whole process.
Exactly.
Okay, last question. Question 5. An appropriate title for the text is most likely to be Fors and Againsts of DNA testing and its problems. DNA testing outside the lab lies behind DNA testing. So what title do you think sums up the whole text the best?
Well, the text talks about the good stuff, like how easy these tests are to get and all the things they can be used for, but then it also spends a lot of time on the downsides, like the limitations and the questions about accuracy.
Yeah, for sure.
So DNA testing and its problems, that seems like a good fit.
What about the other ones, like Fors and Againsts of DNA testing?
It's close, but I think the text leans more towards the problems,
Okay. What about DNA testing outside the lab?
That's more about the accessibility, which is only one part of the whole story.
And lies behind DNA testing that just feels too extreme.
Yeah, the text definitely raises concerns, but it's not accusing anyone of lying.
So DNA testing and its problems seems like the most balanced and accurate title.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, so as we've been talking, I've been thinking about a few things that might be confusing for people, like the different types of tests, paternity, ancestry, kinship. They all kind of blend together.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's important to remember that they all use DNA, but they're trying to answer different questions. So paternity, that's all about proving who the father is. Kinship testing is more general. It's like, are these people related at all? Could be siblings, cousins, whatever. And it's often used in adoption cases. Ancestry testing, that's the one that's trying to tell you where your family came from, like your origins and background.
Okay, that helps. And then all the technical stuff like the Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA, it can be hard to keep track of.
It is a lot of jargon. Think of it this way. The Y chromosome, that's like your family name, the one that gets passed down from father to son. So tracing the Y chromosome is like tracing that name back through the generations.
Makes sense.
And then a mitochondrial DNA, that's only passed down from mothers to their kids, both boys and girls.
Ah, okay.
So it's like following a special family heirloom that's only passed down through the women.
That's a good way to put it.
And these are just two very specific parts of your whole genetic makeup.
Right. I guess that's why those ancestry tests can be misleading, because they're only looking at one little piece.
Exactly.
Another thing that kind of blew my mind was that those databases, the ones they compare your DNA to, they're not always like super organized and scientific. I just assumed it was all very standardized.
Yeah, it's not quite like that, because a lot of these companies are working independently and they're using data from different sources. The way they organize that data and how well they represent different populations, it can vary a lot.
I see.
And that can have a big impact on how accurate your results are, especially if you're from a place that's not well represented in their database.
Okay, so to wrap things up, what are the big takeaways from our deep dive into Text 7?
I think the key points are direct-to-consumer DNA testing, like those paternity kits, are super easy to get now, and people use them for a lot of different reasons.
Right, not just paternity.
Exactly. But when it comes to ancestry testing, you have to be careful. It's easy to think those results are super accurate, but they're really just a very small piece of a much bigger picture. And the whole system relies on these databases, which aren't always put together in the best way.
So yeah, it's cool to learn about your family history, but you have to take those results with a grain of salt. It's not always the whole story.
Exactly.
Well, there you have it. Now you're basically an expert on DNA testing and all the complexities.
Without all the headache of reading the research yourself.
Exactly. So here's something to think about. Now that these tests are becoming so common, like anyone can get one, how do you think that's going to change the way we understand things like family, identity, even history?
It's definitely something to consider.
It's pretty mind-blowing. All right, that's it for our deep dive today. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for having me.